Welcome to the debate. Right now, in New York City, just 200 people fund enough of the city's budget to cover its entire $5.4 billion deficit.
Yeah, which is an absolutely staggering statistic when you sit with it.
It really is. So today, we're asking what happens if a new tax makes those exact 200 people pack up and leave. We're unpacking the tension inside New York State's recently announced $268 billion budget handshake agreement.
Right, and specifically, we're drilling down into the proposed pied-à-terre tax. I mean, this is a policy born directly out of Mayor Zoran Mamdani's pretty aggressive Tax the Rich campaign, which is aimed squarely at closing that massive $5.4 billion city budget hole.
Exactly. I'll be taking the position that this pied-à-terre surcharge is a precise, equitable, and structurally necessary tool that targets unused wealth storage without burdening the working-class residents.
And I'll argue that the tax is built on fundamentally flawed logistical valuations. And when you combine those mechanical flaws with the explicitly hostile political rhetoric, it risks triggering capital flight that could just devastate a surprisingly fragile municipal tax base.
So to really get why this specific policy is on the table right now, we have to understand the mechanics of the fiscal crisis New York City is navigating. The Mamdani administration isn't dealing with a slight revenue dip.
Far from it.
Right. They are staring down a $5.4 billion structural gap. You can't just find that kind of money by tweaking parking fines,
No, absolutely not.
Now, the mayor has consistently pushed for broad, sweeping increases in income and corporate taxes. But Governor Kathy Hochul drew a very strict line in the sand. She held firm on refusing to raise statewide income or corporate taxes.
Which effectively put a lid on the traditional levers of revenue. I mean, it forced the city to look for much more creative or perhaps desperate sources of income.
Desperate might be a strong word, but yeah, that's where the pied-à-terre tax enters the picture as a rational, negotiated response. Let's look at how it's actually designed to work, because it isn't a blanket property tax.
Right, it's highly specific.
Exactly. It's a targeted surcharge exclusively on non-primary residences. We're talking about 1 to 3 family homes, condominiums, and co-ops that are valued at over $5 million. And there's a very deliberate mechanism built into it.
The rental exemption.
Yes, if an owner rents their property out to a full-time tenant, they don't pay the surcharge. The target here is explicitly vacancy. Mayor Mamdani is essentially making a deeper structural critique of the modern global economy. Ultra-wealthy non-residents are using New York City real estate as a passive wealth storage mechanism.
A safe deposit box in the sky.
Exactly that. They buy a penthouse, leave it empty for 10 months a year, and benefit from the security and, the relentless appreciation of the city's real estate market. But because they don't live there full-time, they aren't paying city or state income taxes. So this tax ensures they actually contribute to the municipal infrastructure that secures their investment in the first place.
Well, I genuinely understand the appeal of the argument. Taxing vacant luxury homes sounds like an incredibly elegant solution to a very messy budget problem.
It has great optics.
It has phenomenal political optics. But the underlying Tax the Rich campaign driving this policy is frankly economically reckless, and the policy itself is logistically unsound. We really need to understand the extreme precariousness of New York's tax base.
Okay, let's look at the base.
We aren't talking about a broad, resilient foundation where everyone chips in a little. We're essentially balancing the entire city's finances on the tip of a needle. Look at who is paying for the city right now. Just 0.9% of taxpayers. That's exactly 99,404 millionaires are responsible for 44.6% of the city's total income tax liability.
That is roughly $32 billion, right?
Yes, $32 billion from less than 1% of the population. It's more than just concentrated. Think of it like an inverted skyscraper. Instead of a wide base supporting a narrow top, the entire structural load rests on a handful of pillars at the very top. Crack one of those pillars and the whole structure shakes.
But are we really cracking the pillars with a surcharge?
Let's go even further up that inverted pyramid. A mere 200 individuals pay over $5.5 billion in local taxes.
The city's budget deficit is $5.4 billion. Just 200 people essentially fund an equivalent amount. And into this highly mobile ecosystem, the city is introducing a tax that, according to NYC Comptroller Mark Levine's report, is riddled with deep valuation loopholes.
The Levine report does point out some administrative hurdles, yes.
It's more than hurdles. The administration projects this will bring in $500 million annually, but Levine's analysis suggests that due to behavioral responses and logistical flaws, it might only generate between $340 million and $380 million. We're risking a $32 billion tax base to chase a deeply flawed $340 million revenue stream.
I want to challenge that concept of the inverted skyscraper and the assumption that this tax automatically cracks those pillars, because the actual structure of the policy addresses fairness without being overly punitive.
How so?
Well, the proposed surcharge isn't a blunt instrument that hits everyone equally. It operates on a graduated scale. It starts at a 0.5% surcharge for properties valued between $5 million and $10 million, and it scales up to 4.0% for properties valued over $25 million.
Which is still a significant carrying cost.
It's a carrying cost, but let's put it in perspective. If someone owns a $50 million super tall condo on Billionaire's Row, a property they rarely visit, this tax generates $1.2 million annually from that single asset. For someone with the liquidity to park $50 million in an empty condo, $1.2 million is a carrying cost, not a financial crisis.
Sure, but
And we actually have empirical evidence that this type of policy works exactly as intended. Look at the Vancouver 2017 empty homes tax, which functions on a very similar behavioral principle.
okay.
The data is really compelling. A 2024 study showed it led to a 21% reduction in vacant homes. It forced owners into a choice: either pay for the privilege of keeping the home empty, which funds city services, or rent it out, which adds vital supply to a starved housing market.
That sounds great in theory, but they're only wins if the broader economic ecosystem remains stable while you're running the experiment. You're looking at the policy in a vacuum, assuming these property owners behave like, predictable algorithms.
I don't think they're algorithms, but they are rational economic actors.
But economic policy is deeply tied to the political climate, and the climate surrounding this specific tax is undeniably hostile. It's actively driving away the exact tax base you need. We're seeing visceral public reactions from the titans of the real estate and financial sectors.
You mean the earnings call comments?
Yeah, you have Stephen Roth, the CEO of Vornado Realty Trust, going on an earnings call and literally comparing the tax the rich slogan to racial slurs. He called the rhetoric hateful and disgusting.
Which, let's be honest, many would argue is a vast, somewhat absurd overreaction to a fairly standard progressive fiscal policy. Asking for a 0.5% surcharge on a second home is hardly a systemic attack.
Whether you think it's an overreaction or not is entirely beside the point. What matters is that it represents the genuine mindset of the people who allocate capital in the city. Look at Ken Griffin, the founder of Citadel. Mayor Mamdani's campaign literally filmed a political video outside Griffin's $238 million penthouse to single him out.
Right, as a symbol of excess.
But Griffin called the tactics creepy and weird and publicly announced that Citadel is doubling down on moving its operations to Miami. This isn't theoretical. This is capital flight happening in real time. The rhetoric signals to the business community that they are adversaries to be squeezed. And when you treat highly mobile capital as an adversary, it leaves.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on the actual mechanics of capital flight in this specific context.
All right, go ahead.
We have to separate the political theater from the economic reality here. There's a logical distinction in the source material that we absolutely have to highlight. The pied-à-terre tax targets non-residents. By definition, the people paying this surcharge are individuals whose primary residence is outside the 5 boroughs.
True, but they still invest in the city?
They do, but let's follow the logic of this supposed capital flight. If a non-resident owner feels alienated by the rhetoric and they decide to sell their $10 million vacant condo, what exactly is the city losing in terms of income tax?
Well,
That individual takes 0 New York City income tax with them to Miami or Connecticut because they weren't paying New York City income tax in the first place. They aren't residents.
So does selling an unused passive asset truly constitute dangerous capital flight, or does it simply add much-needed supply to the top of the housing market, allowing someone who actually wants to live and pay income taxes in the city to buy it?
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You're assuming that the sale of that asset happens in a perfectly isolated vacuum and has no downstream effects.
What kind of downstream effects?
When non-residents stop buying luxury real estate, the developers stop building it. When they stop building it, the transaction taxes, the mortgage recording taxes, the real estate transfer taxes, they evaporate. Those are massive revenue streams for the city and the MTA.
The real estate market adjusts, though.
It impacts the broader perception of New York as a safe place to invest. But, even if we set aside the psychological impacts of the rhetoric and the secondary effects, we have to look at the logistical nightmare of actually executing this tax. This is where Comptroller Levine's report is so incredibly damning.
Okay, let's get into the weeds on this, because the valuation of co-ops and condos is famously complex in New York. Why exactly does Levine's report say the math doesn't work?
It's more than just complex. In the context of this specific tax, the city's valuation methodology actively defeats the purpose of the law. The New York City Department of Finance assesses condominiums and co-ops based on a state statutory requirement to value them as if they were rental buildings.
Right, the hypothetical income approach?
Exactly.
Wait, so if I buy a $20 million condo on the open market, the city doesn't tax me based on that $20 million price tag? They pretend it's an apartment building?
Yes, exactly. Because state law requires treating similar types of structures similarly, the Department of Finance has to ignore the ultra-luxury premium of owning that specific exclusive unit. They have to ask, if this building were a standard rent-regulated apartment complex, how much income would it generate?
Oh, wow.
And that hypothetical rental income is used to calculate the assessed value. This means the assessed value sitting on the city's tax rolls is a terrible, artificially suppressed reflection of the true market value.
So the $5 million threshold gets skewed.
Completely skewed. When you apply a $5 million market value threshold to properties assessed this way, the pool of eligible properties collapses. Levine's report shows that because of these adjustments, the pool shrinks from over 19,000 down to just about 11,200. You're losing nearly half your target base on day one.
Okay, the Department of Finance methodology certainly suppresses the assessed values compared to what a property might sell for on the open market. It's a known quirk of the system.
And it gets worse when you look at the mixed-use loophole. Imagine a $6 million two-family brownstone. The owner uses the bottom half as a pied-à-terre for themselves when they visit, and they rent the top half out full-time to a tenant. How does the city allocate the value for the tax?
They probably split it based on square footage or units.
Right, and if they split it evenly, the pied-à-terre portion is valued at $3 million. Suddenly, it falls below the $5 million threshold, and it's completely exempt from the tax, even though the building itself is worth $6 million.
Ah, I see.
Levine points out that this approach would effectively exempt almost all two-family properties in the first two tax brackets and most three-family properties in the first three brackets. You're left with fewer than 200 two-family buildings across the entire city that would actually be subject to the tax. The policy is a sieve.
Look, I'll readily acknowledge those logistical weaknesses. The hypothetical rental valuation for condos is an archaic system designed decades ago, and allocating value in mixed-use buildings is a genuine administrative hurdle. The Comptroller's report is completely right to point these things out.
So you agree it's structurally flawed?
I agree the collection mechanism is imperfect. But pointing out a mechanical flaw in a system is a reason to refine the system, not a reason to abandon a fundamentally necessary policy. Think of the city's tax base like a corporate cap table.
Okay, a cap table.
You have the core operators, the working class residents who keep the city running day to day. And you have the non-voting shares, the foreign investors and non-residents who hold equity in the city's real estate but don't participate in the daily operations.
Right.
When the company is facing a $5.4 billion shortfall, it makes complete economic sense to issue a targeted capital call to the non-voting shares rather than cutting the salaries of the core operators. The valuation loopholes mean we might only capture $340 million instead of the projected $500 million, but $340 million is still a massive, vital injection of capital.
But a capital call that makes your biggest investors dump their shares and walk away is a bad strategy. Levine explicitly noted that behavioral changes, people finding loopholes, restructuring into LLCs, or just selling the assets could reduce expected revenue by about 10% in just the first 2 years.
Sure, there will be behavioral responses,
And those losses compound over time as the market adapts to avoid the tax entirely.
but even Comptroller Levine, the author of the very report detailing all of these logistical hurdles, ultimately concluded that he supports including the tax in the city's financial plan. He didn't say scrap it, he just requires a transparent baseline for auditing and monitoring the revenue.
He's a politician. He has to hedge his bets.
Well, I have to push back on the broader economic context here. Let's say we agree with you. Let's say this targeted wealth tax on vacant homes is just too flawed to implement, and we know the governor absolutely refuses to touch broad income or corporate taxes. What is the credible alternative framework?
The alternative is
How do you propose the city actually closes a $5.4 billion gap? You can't just say, don't tax the rich without explaining what municipal services you're going to cut or what working class taxes you're going to raise. The math has to work somewhere.
The alternative is fundamentally recognizing that you can't tax your way out of a structural deficit when your tax base is this highly mobile. The alternative is reining in the record municipal spending that created the $5.4 billion gap in the first place.
But reining in spending means service cuts.
You bring up protecting the working class, which is a vital goal, but suppressing investment and construction at the top of the market inevitably cascades down. When ultra-luxury construction slows down because foreign investors stop buying these pied-à-terres, who actually loses their jobs?
Well, the developers take a hit.
It's not just the billionaire buyers or developers. It's the construction workers. It's the tradespeople, the electricians, the maintenance staffs, the doormen. James Whelan, the president of the Real Estate Board of New York, was very clear about this following the report's release.
Of course, RBNY would oppose a real estate tax.
But his logic holds up. He stated that if implemented haphazardly, this tax will result in less investment, less housing production, and ultimately less revenue for the city, the state, and the MTA. You're assuming the $340 million in revenue is guaranteed. I'm suggesting that the secondary economic damage could cost the city far more than that in lost jobs for the exact people you're trying to protect.
But again, that assumes a one-to-one correlation between a surcharge on a vacant $20 million condo and the total collapse of the New York real estate development market. I think that drastically underestimates the resilience of the city.
I don't think it's a total collapse, but it's a freeze at the top.
New York real estate has survived incredibly high interest rates, multiple global recessions, and massive previous tax code overhauls. The underlying value of the city, its culture, its financial markets, its global centrality, doesn't just evaporate because a non-resident has to pay an extra percentage point on an empty apartment.
It doesn't evaporate, but it relocates.
And as the Mamdani administration pointed out, if the legislation is thoughtfully crafted and the loopholes are aggressively monitored, it will hit its targets. It's just a matter of administrative will.
Administrative will can't override economic reality, and it certainly can't override state law. The Department of Finance can't just magically rewrite the statutory valuation laws for condos overnight because the mayor wants them to. That requires a state-level legislative overhaul in Albany, which is historically incredibly difficult to achieve.
It is difficult, yes.
And while you dismiss the psychological impact, you can't ignore the signaling effect. The top 200 taxpayers are watching this unfold. They're watching a mayor film campaign videos outside their homes. When your city relies on 200 people for $5.5 billion of its operating budget, you simply don't have the luxury of treating them as political props.
So, to summarize my position on this, the pied-à-terre tax is a measured, economically rational step toward fiscal fairness. New York City is facing a multi-billion-dollar structural deficit, and it simply cannot balance its books by squeezing the working class.
Right.
By precisely targeting the ultra-wealthy who utilize New York City real estate as a passive wealth vault, enjoying the security of this city without contributing to its income tax base, the city can generate hundreds of millions of dollars in vital revenue. Yes, the implementation will require significant adjustment, especially regarding property valuations, but it's a structurally necessary policy.
And to summarize my perspective, While the political intention of the tax is entirely understandable, the economic reality is a logistically flawed policy based on hypothetical valuations that will struggle to meet its revenue projections.
The projections are definitely a point of friction.
Exactly. And furthermore, when combined with highly aggressive political rhetoric, it takes an unnecessary and dangerous risk. It threatens to alienate the vital 0.9% of taxpayers who currently fund nearly half of the entire city budget. In the attempt to squeeze a few $100 million from vacant properties, the city risks triggering a wave of capital flight that could cost it far more in lost secondary economic activity.
Well, we clearly have a persistent disagreement over whether this tax will act as a vital, stabilizing revenue stream or an economic deterrent that cracks the foundation of the city's tax base. But, exploring the mechanics of this single policy reveals just how intricate municipal finance truly is.
It certainly does. And it's worth noting that this pied-à-terre tax is just one fraction of a massive $268 billion state budget agreement. From education funding formulas to transit overhauls, there are countless other complexities hidden within that document waiting to be unpacked.
So true. The budget is ultimately a reflection of our priorities. And as we've seen today, figuring out how to fund those priorities is rarely a simple equation. Think back to the Skyline Towers we're debating. Are they passive wealth vaults that need to be tapped? Or are they the structural load-bearing pillars holding up the city's broader economy? Perhaps the answer depends entirely on which floor you're standing on.